Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Draco Sinister. So this chapter is another heavily edited chapter. So initially, what had happened in this chapter was just incredibly long-winded, is how I'm going to put it. When I was rereading this, I was reminded just very sharply about how Cassandra tended to treat writing this particular series sort of as if you were watching a Buffy the Vampire Slayer episode. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of long, drawn-out, draggy parts where the characters are just sort of waiting around, and the villain isn't really doing much of anything. Which kind of makes sense because, when you're writing fan fiction, sometimes you don't really have the ability to write it all at once. So you tend to have to write it in spurts, and sometimes you forget what you're writing, or, where you were, or you're not sure what's going to happen next, so you tend to do a lot of fluff. But it's been years, so I am cutting her fluff in order to make this a more cohesive, free-flowing fanfiction. Without further ado, let us just get right into it. Chapter 10, Bindings and Summonings. Ineverate. Hermione swam up through blind darkness, blinked her eyes open, and saw more darkness. She cried out in a muffled voice, and the darkness vanished, replaced by pale yellow light and an anxious face bending over her. It was Sirius, holding a damp cloth in one hand. "Hermione," he said, "are you all right?" She nodded, feeling sharp pain blossom behind her eyes as she did so. Slowly, her senses began to register her surroundings. She was lying on a couch in the Weasley living room, and there was a blanket over her. "Harry," she whispered. "Draco. The others." "Ron and Ginny are still unconscious," said Sirius, not quite meeting her eyes. "They were hit with stunning spells, like you were." He hesitated. "Neither Draco nor Harry are here." Tears burst from her eyes. "They're not here! Where are they?" "I don't know, but I do know they aren't dead." Sirius held up a hand. "Harry, at least, is fine, and I can't imagine that whoever took them would have killed Draco and left Harry alive." "How do you know Harry's fine?" Sirius leaned forward and pulled up the sleeve of his right hand. On his wrist was a flat silver bracelet Hermione vaguely remembered having seen once before. It was set with a dark red stone that gleamed the way Crookshanks's eyes gleamed when the light hit them. "I charmed this bracelet a while ago, using some hair that I took from Harry while he was sleeping. It's a simple Vivicus charm. As long as the gem glows steadily, Harry is alive and healthy." He smiled at Hermione. Not a real smile, she knew, but he meant it to comfort her, and she appreciated that. "My aura training was not entirely wasted, it seems." Hermione shut her eyes, trying to think through the pain in her head, which beat a steady pulse that said plaintively, "Harry, Draco, Harry. Where's Narcissa?" she whispered. "Narcissa apparated to the Ministry to alert the Weasleys. They should be here any second." "Okay, but why haven't you woken Ron and Ginny?" Sirius hesitated. "I haven't woken Ron or Ginny, Hermione, because Charlie is dead." That brought Hermione into a sitting position, despite the shooting pain in her head. "Charlie? Dead?" Sirius nodded, his face drawn and somber. "We found his body in the kitchen. Someone hit him with the killing curse." He paused. "Hermione, who was it? What happened? Hermione shook her head, bewildered. Charlie wasn't dead. He couldn't be dead. It didn't make any sense. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. A piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. Hermione's right hand went up automatically and closed around the right canthe. Immediately she felt calmer, and her breathing became normal again. She looked up at Sirius, saw the grief in his face, the terrible worry, and decided that she had better tell him everything. When she had finished, Sirius looked at her incredulously, and Hermione covered her face with her hands. "That's all I remember." Sirius rocked back on his heels, his face blank. "Merlin's beard," he said. "Charlie Weasley? I don't believe it." He glanced towards the kitchen, and she could see through the open door the shrouded form that had to be Charlie's body. Sirius's hands were shaking, and he looked from Charlie back over to her and said, almost as if he hadn't heard her last statement, "He offered the sword to Slytherin. He called him Master?" Hermione nodded. "I heard him. We all heard him. And Sirius, earlier when Charlie took the lycanthropy from me, he said a very odd-sounding spell over it." "Can you remember it?" Hermione nodded. "Monitum exquiod iadiri nequiat." Sirius put his head in his hands, and when he looked up, his dark eyes were blank. "That's a clairaudience charm," he said. "It opens a line of communication between the speaker and someone far away." "So he was communicating something to Slytherin," she said. Sirius winced and looked at Ron and Ginny. "I can't bear the thought of waking them up," he said. "I hope for Molly and Arthur's sake that it was an imperious curse." Hermione sat up slowly, feeling her head spin. "I don't think it was," she heard herself say. Sirius glanced over at her. "You don't think Charlie—" "No," interrupted Hermione, getting to her feet and refusing Sirius's offer of assistance. She crossed the room and walked through the open door into the kitchen. She heard Sirius get to his feet and follow her, pausing in the doorway to watch as she tilted her head back and looked up at the clock on the wall. Ron and Ginny's hands had returned to the home position. Percy's said work, Fred and George's traveling, Bill's said home, and next to his was Charlie's, also at home. She bit her lip and turned slowly to the blanket-wrapped figure on the floor. Then she knelt by it, and with a decisive gesture, yanked the blanket off. Sirius leapt in surprise. "Hermione!" But she wasn't listening. Charlie's body was still, already cold, his face slack as if in sleep. Suppressing a shudder, she reached out, took hold of his stiff right hand, and turned it over, palm up. It was unmarked. Sirius was staring at her. "What are you doing?" She dropped the hand and got to her feet. "Charlie touched the sword," she said. "He's not a magician. It should have burned him." Sirius shook her head. "Hermione, I don't—" Ignoring his questions, Hermione hurried across the room to the fireplace. Ranged along the top of the mantel were 7 identical jars, each one labeled with the name of a Weasley child, starting with Bill at the left and ending with Ginny on the right. Hermione picked up one of the silver bottles, flicked it open with her thumb, shook some powder into her hand, and tossed the sparkling handful into the wizarding fire that always burned in the Weasleys' fireplace. The flames turned orange, then blue, and a single, sharp, musical note resonated through the room. Hermione waited, holding her breath. The flames darkened suddenly and solidified, and then a head and shoulders emerged from the fire. An astonished-looking face turned towards her and pushed dark red hair back from his eyes as he stared at her in surprise. "Hermione," he said, "what's going on? Usually only my mum uses this way of getting in touch with me. Is something the matter?" Hermione released the breath she had been holding. "Hello, Charlie," she said. Light came first, stinging the backs of his eyelids, and then pain, aching pain in his shoulders, back and legs, as if he'd been thrown hard against a wall. Maybe he had. Harry opened his eyes slowly, and the world danced around him in a whirl of color, primarily blue, with lesser patches of green, black, and red. He propped himself up on his elbows and looked around. He was in what was probably the most enormous room he had ever seen, bigger than the Great Hall at Hogwarts or the ballroom at Malfoy Manor. The walls were green-veined marble and rose up and up and up, terminating in a ceiling so high its detail was lost in darkness. The floor was marble, too, smooth and slippery. The center of the room curved down into a huge, circular depression, not deep or large enough to be an amphitheater, although it resembled it well enough. Black velvet tapestries hung from the walls, picked out in patterns of silver. There was a huge oak wardrobe with 2 enormous doors that stood propped against the far wall. There were no other doors that he could see, and no windows. "Good morning," said a familiar voice in his ear. "Or maybe afternoon, or maybe night. It's bloody impossible to tell in this place. How's your head?" Harry looked around. That hurt, too. Draco was sitting near him, leaning his back against one of the blue marble walls. He was still barefoot, and Harry saw that there was blood on his shirt, as well as long burned streaks that looked as if he'd been dragged through ashes. Around his wrists there was something that gleamed and sparkled in the dim light. Harry wondered what had happened after they blacked out. The last thing he remembered was bright green light. He shivered. "Where are we?" he asked, ignoring Draco's question, because if he were being honest, his head felt rotten. "I'm not sure." "How did we get here?" Draco replied with a shrug. Harry pulled himself into a sitting position and noticed 2 things. There was something sticky on his chest, and his wrists also appeared to be manacled in the same cuffs as Draco's. He glanced down and saw that the sleeve of his white shirt was covered in blood, mostly dried, but some of it looked new. The cuffs he recognized as adamantine. "That figures," he thought, and pulled his sleeve up to reveal a long cut along the side of his arm, oozing dark blood. The sight of it seemed to jog his memory. He looked up at Draco. "Hermione," he said in a fearful tone. "Ron and Ginny, are they—" Draco looked away. "I don't know." Avoiding Harry's gaze, he stood up and crossed the room, avoiding the dip in the floor as he did so. His bare feet made no noise on the marble floor as he began running a hand along the wall, looking for gaps or chinks. Harry was reminded of a cat, curiously prowling the borders of new territory. "Maybe you don't know," Harry thought at him, "but what do you think?" Draco didn't turn around, but kept moving towards the opposite side of the room. "Hermione's all right," he said. "I feel it. I think Ron and Ginny are all right as well, but I can't promise you anything." Harry couldn't have said why, but he felt that Draco was correct. "Malfoy, what about Charlie?" Draco paused in front of the wardrobe, his shoulders tensing. Wincing a little from the ache in his back, Harry crossed to the edge of the circular depression and stared down into the empty space. "Was it my imagination," he said to the back of Draco's head, "or were Charlie and Slytherin working together?" Draco turned around and looked at him. "Yep," he said, and there was finality in his calm gray eyes. "I practically expected them to go into a planning huddle. But Charlie wouldn't do that," Harry argued. "I agree." Draco turned back to the wardrobe, jerked the doors open, and looked inside. "I don't think that was Charlie," he said, his voice a little muffled. Harry blinked. Not Charlie. Not Charlie, said Draco firmly, and then he gave a little shout of surprise and exclaimed, Potter, you've got to see this. He retracted his head from the wardrobe and grinned at him with sly amusement. Somebody left us a present, he said, and he held out something that flashed red and silver and green in the bluish light of the room. Harry stared in amazement. It was a sword. 2 swords, to be exact. Salazar Slytherin's and Godric Gryffindor's swords. He reached out and took it out of Draco's hand, running his fingers over the smooth blade. Why would he leave us these? He wondered out loud. No idea, but I'll tell you one thing. This place is a lot nicer than I was expecting. Usually your standard issue dungeon is pretty grotty. Slime, worms, and howling screams of some poor bastard being tortured in the cell next to yours. Draco shrugged. The worst thing we seem to have to contend with here is the somewhat monochromatic colour scheme. That and the lack of food. Harry, who had been growing increasingly aware of the rumbling in his stomach, was dismayed. There's no food. Draco shook his head. Not that I saw. Harry sighed, holding out the sword carefully as he walked to the side of the room and threw himself down on the floor to study it. I guess I wouldn't have trusted any food he provided for us anyway. A thought suddenly struck Draco, and he rummaged in his pockets for a moment. Hey, Potter, he said, suddenly, and crossed to where Harry sat. I seem to have found a scrumdiddlyumptious chocolate bar in my pocket. You want half? Sure, replied Harry morosely. Why not? He took the half and looked sideways at Draco, who was engaged in eating his portion of the candy. I would have thought your busy little mind would have been ticking over possible escape plans by now. Draco swallowed and made a face. Ugh, lint. Look, Potter, there's no way out of this room. How can you be so sure? Well, there are no doors and windows, no secret passageways, no breaks in the stone anywhere, and on top of all that, I thought you were a cunning plan guy. I didn't say I hadn't come up with a plan. I have come up with a plan. I just don't think you'll like it. I might like it, said Harry, around a mouthful of chocolate. No, said Draco, you really won't like it. Just because I'm a Gryffindor does not mean that I can't appreciate cunning plans, Malfoy, Harry said, slightly vexed. Haven't I gone along with at least 6 of your harebrained schemes already? Haven't I been there for you, taken your side? Draco grinned hugely. This is turning into quite an ode to our relationship, Potter, he said. Keep it up. I'm feeling all tingly. That's probably just the residual chafing from the leather trousers, Harry groused. Those fucking trousers, said Draco irritably. I have the feeling that nobody is ever going to let me forget them, even though I only wore them once and I was against my will. Harry snorted. Now I'm imagining Charlie holding you down and forcing the leather trousers onto you. Hey, that's your pervy little fantasy, Potter, not mine. Harry glared at him. Are you going to tell me your bloody plan or not? Fine, Draco said. My plan was this. We wait here for Slytherin to come and kill us, and when he does, we die. Horrible, screaming deaths. What do you think? Harry was annoyed. That's your idea of a winning plan? I thought it was the most likely option, considering that we can't get these cuffs off. I can't believe you're just giving up. I'm not giving up. I'm being realistic. You're giving up. I am not. Yes, you are. This is a pointless discussion, but it does pass the time. Distracts me from thinking about the fact that my whole body hurts. It should, said Draco, finishing his chocolate with a regretful air. Slytherin threw you into a wall, and you've got a black eye going there. Very sporty. Well, you look pretty unscathed, said Harry resentfully. But I do think something very strange is going on here. He looked back down at the sword. Why would he just leave us our swords? Draco opened his mouth to retort. Then his eyes flicked to something behind Harry, and all the blood drained out of his face. Potter. At first, Harry didn't look up from his sword. What? In answer, Draco's hand shot out and grabbed his shoulder, hard enough that Harry looked up at him. Right now, Draco's voice ground out, I pretty much want you to panic. Harry stared. Something was emerging from the shadows at the far end of the room. Something huge. Something so enormous it was unreal. A monster out of a nightmare, out of legend. Something that couldn't possibly exist, but it did. It was nearly as big as a dragon, and the shadow it cast on the wall behind it was twisted and grotesque. Leathery wings were folded along the sides of its lion-shaped body, and its huge, misshapen lion's head was crowned with a man's face, the size of a giant's. Sparkling claws, each a foot in length, extended from its paws, and its tail was a long, supple-looking scorpion's, which whipped back and forth with the speed of a striking snake as it advanced slowly towards them. What the hell is that? Said Harry very slowly. Manticore, said Draco briefly. Ginny had never seen the Burrows so full of tension. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley had come home, of course, and were currently standing in the kitchen looking white-faced. Mr. Weasley was in an intense whispered discussion with a large group of Aurors. Mrs. Weasley, having tearfully kissed and hugged a revived Ron and Ginny as well as Hermione, had retired to her room to lie down. Narcissa had returned to the manor, and Sirius had gone to the ministry to help ascertain the identity of the fake Charlie Weasley. Ron was sitting on the living room couch next to Hermione, who looked pale but composed. I can't believe we thought that was actually him, he said, still looking numb with shock. I can't believe he made us dinner, Ginny said in a nauseated tone, coming over to sit next to them. And we nearly ate it. It could have been anyone. A Death Eater, Wormtail, anyone. She clenched her fist. When you look at someone, you just assume they are who they seem to be, said Hermione in a dead sort of voice. I mean, I thought Harry was the person I knew best in the world, and it took me 2 days to figure out it was Draco pretending to be him. Ron seemed about to say something to this when the door opened and Charlie walked in. He looked tired. There were shadows under his normally cheerful green eyes, and his red hair was in tousled disarray. Hello all, he said tentatively. Nobody moved. I promise it's really me this time, he said, sounding slightly annoyed. They all stared at him, and no one spoke. Charlie made an exasperated noise. Right then, ask me anything, he said. Ask me what Mom's favourite colour is, or what Percy's favourite candy is, or what's my name? Ron interrupted, looking slightly wide-eyed. What year is it? Charlie rolled his eyes. Look, we're checking for Charlie here, not massive head trauma. What's my middle name? Ron demanded. Bilious, said Charlie promptly. This got a reaction from Hermione. Bilious? She demanded, staring at Ron. Ron looked defensive. What's wrong with bilious? Well, for one thing, it means your initials spell out Revolution British Wrestling. Ron looked nonplussed. What's that? Charlie was now grinning, a tired sort of grin. Your middle name is Bilious, he repeated to Ron. Your favourite colour is red, but you hate maroon. When you were 10, you cried because Mum wouldn't let you buy a racing broom of your very own, and last year you told me you thought the prettiest girl in school was— All right, interrupted Ron, ears bright pink. You're Charlie. Now belt up. Charlie threw himself down into the armchair opposite Ginny and stretched out his legs. You sure you don't want me to go on? He grinned, but his expression turned serious as Mr. Weasley entered the room, looking grave. "I'm going back to the ministry," he said to Charlie. "There are 20 auras outside the house already, and the AC is sending over 20 more, but I want you to stay here." His glance swept over Ron, Ginny, and Hermione, and the implication was clear. "Stay here and keep an eye on the kids. You lot," he said to the 3 teenagers on the couch, trying to keep his voice as light as possible. "With 40 auras outside, this should be the safest wizarding house in Britain, but you're not to go outside for any reason, not even into the garden, not until I come home and tell you otherwise. Understood?" Ron looked at him and spoke for them all. "Understood." Mr. Weasley looked as if he were swallowing past a lump in his throat and nodded briskly. "All right then," he said, and disapparated. Hermione stood up. "I'm tired," she said. "I think I'll go get in bed, do some reading." She looked at Ron. "Could I borrow a t-shirt or something to wear?" Ron got to his feet. "I'll get you some pajamas from upstairs." Ginny watched as her brother and Hermione walked out of the room and felt a sudden flash of envy. Ron, Harry, and Hermione had always formed such a perfect little circle. No one else had ever been able to get in. Then Draco came along and seemed to have effortlessly punched his way in. Even if he wasn't always welcomed by the 2 boys, there was certainly no question that he wasn't going away anytime soon. If nothing else, Hermione's sheer determination would keep him part of the group, and the other 2 would always do whatever she wanted, in the end. Ginny often felt as if she didn't quite belong, as if she were an outsider who had shown up at a party without being invited. "Ginny?" It was Charlie speaking, looking at her with questioning eyes. "Did you really think that that person was me? That I would do something like that?" Ginny pursed her lips, trying to focus her thoughts. "Well, at first he seemed perfectly normal, and then in the end everything happened so fast we didn't really have a chance to think. Then we were unconscious." She raised her eyes to her brother's, saw the worry in his expression, the shadows in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Charlie," she said, her voice cracking. "It wasn't fair even to think that for a minute." Charlie was studying his hands and took a moment to reply. "It's hard to say," he said finally, "just what people are really capable of. Sometimes we think they're doing the right thing, and then it turns out to be a mistake. But it's too late to change things." Ginny was confused. "What are you talking about?" Charlie smiled faintly. "Just rambling pointlessly. Come on, let's get into the kitchen. I'll make you some tea." "According to his operating license, his name is Alexander Taylor," said Mad-Eye Moody to Sirius, who was standing next to the body on the gurney with his hands in his pockets and an intent expression on his face. "And according to his ministry registration, he's a werewolf." "A werewolf?" Sirius glanced down at the body of the man who had disguised himself as Charlie Weasley. The glamour he had been under was beginning to fade. The red hair was turning black, the distinctive Weasley freckles disappearing. "Actually, that makes sense." "Does it?" said Mad-Eye neutrally. Sirius nodded without answering. Mad-Eye knew about Lupin. Nearly everyone in the wizarding world did, but Mad-Eye also knew of their friendship. "What I don't get," added the scarred old Auror ruminatively, scratching his head, "is how the attacker managed to get into the house. Arthur Weasley is no fool. He's got his house well warded." Sirius shrugged. "The wards are set to recognize family members by sight, so it's no big mystery how the false Charlie got in. As for the other, Hermione Granger told me that Charlie spent the afternoon working in the garden. I suspect what he was actually doing was taking the wards down. It wouldn't be too hard to do from the property. And then, when he was done, he summoned his master. Sirius sighed, feeling weary. He raised his eyes and glanced around. He and Mad-Eye were alone in the dark corridor. Has he got any family?
The werewolf? Not that we can find a record of. Probably for the best, considering.
Considering what? Asked Sirius sharply. Mad-Eye wasn't looking at him, but down at the body of the man on the gurney.
He has injuries on his hands, he said. Not defensive injuries. Ones that look as if he clawed his way out of something. A cage or some kind of holding pen. The glamour hid them. I suspect he was being called, as I'm sure all werewolves in Britain are being called. That would account for all the werewolf sightings that have been in the news lately.
Sirius tensed. That's an interesting theory. So far, he had told no one about Lupin being called, and didn't want to mention that now. He knew this made no sense, logically, and perhaps ethically as well, but he didn't care. He wasn't prepared to answer questions about Remus, and that was final.
It's not a pleasant process, being cold, said Mad-Eye, avoiding Sirius's eyes. It's agonizing, and it goes on and on until the one being cold either answers the summons or dies.
Sirius looked down, his hands tight on the metal edges of the gurney. The red gleam in his bracelet winked as he turned his wrist. Is there nothing that could be done for them?
There was talk of creating a potion to cure it, back when the Dark Lord was in power, but I don't know if anything ever came of that.
Mad-Eye cleared his throat.
How are the Weasleys managing?
They're all right. They were frantic at first. Still are, probably. But the Burrow is knee-deep in auras right now. I'll have a constant 24-hour guard of 40 auras at least, ringed around the house and the grounds.
And will you be one of those auras?
Mad-Eye asked. Sirius suspected that Mooney would have liked to be one himself, but in consideration of his age, Mad-Eye had been restricted to inactive duty. He shook his head. No, he said. I'm going home. There's something I have to do. There was a soft click as the cuffs on Draco's wrists fell away as if a switch had been thrown. He raised his hand for his sword. Accio! His sword flew into his grasp. Harry was already holding his, but not with a lot of attention. He was staring at the manticore as it advanced on them. There was another soft click as the cuffs around his wrists also fell away. Stupefy! He shouted, pointing his hand towards the monster. The jet of light that shot from his fingers struck the manticore squarely in the chest. It roared and reared back, and its huge shadow fell over them. Draco glared at Harry. Well done, Potter. You've managed to piss it off. Do you know that its sting carries the most deadly poison known to man? Just thought I'd mention it. It was worth a try, Harry shot back, then looked at the monster with narrowed eyes. It was too big for a hex to kill it, but if he had killed a basilisk with Gryffindor's sword, perhaps he could kill this too. He tightened his grip on the sword and raced towards the manticore, as if he had completely lost his wits, which he possibly had. Even the manticore seemed surprised, as if it couldn't quite believe its eyes either. Draco didn't blame it. People probably didn't run towards it with great enthusiasm all that often. This most likely accounted for why it actually allowed Harry to get within striking distance. Draco watched in astonishment as Harry completed his race towards the manticore and drove his sword into its chest. The manticore roared a terrible, ear-splitting howl that sounded like 1,000 trains pulling into 1,000 stations all at once. It reared back and struck out with its paw, which sent Harry spinning into the air. He crashed into a wall, fell to the floor, and lay still. Seizing the hilt of the sword with its teeth, the manticore yanked the blade out of its chest, spit it onto the floor, and advanced on Harry, its barbed stinger swishing furiously. Draco felt a jolt of cold spread up his arm from his own sword. If it could have spoken, he knew what it would say. Let it kill him. Harry struggled to sit up, and then Draco couldn't see his face as the manticore moved to block him. Draco raised his hand. Impedimenta! The hex struck the monster in the side. It spun around, glaring furiously. Hey! Draco yelled, waving his arms, although his mouth was very dry. Over here! He paused and blinked. I can't believe I said that. But the manticore appeared to have no problem suspending disbelief. It whirled, roared, and plunged towards Draco, its claws skittering along the marble. He stared, too afraid to even feel any fear. He couldn't imagine his fencing skills were going to do him any good at all. It was simply too big and too fast. It struck out at him with a paw. He threw himself flat and felt the claws whistle over his head. The manticore made a low rumbling sound deep in its chest. Laughter. It's playing with me, he thought in disbelief. Bastard. He sat up, and the next swipe knocked him flat again, the claws raking his shirt, drawing blood. Wincing, he rolled onto his back and looked up to see the huge poison-barbed tail arch back and then whip forward towards his prone form with the speed of a striking snake. He had time to throw his arms over his face, time to think 2 words. Deadly poison. And then something swished over his head, and there was a hard thwack as something else struck the ground next to him. It missed me, he thought, and then he heard a bellow of anguish so loud it split his ears. He jerked upright and saw Harry standing over him, his sword upraised and covered in blood, and behind him the manticore, rearing and spitting in agony, thrashing its tail, which was now jetting blood like a fountain. Harry had sliced it in half, and the thump that Draco had heard had been the sound of the severed scorpion tail landing next to him. It lay on the marble floor in a widening pool of viscous red and black liquids, curling and uncurling a little. Rolling over, he seized the tail, being careful not to grasp it near its poisonous barbed end, and winced at the slimy touch on his hand. He sprang to his feet, vaguely aware that he was drenched in manticore blood, and of the manticore's furious yells as he darted towards it. It lunged, snapping at him, and he saw its double row of razor-sharp teeth. He drew his arm back, and as hard as he could, threw the barbed stinger into the monster's open mouth. Reflexively, its teeth snapped down. Its throat worked to swallow. Then it froze in place, choking and gurgling, lashing its head furiously from side to side as if it could rid itself of its own poison. Its knees began to buckle, and it screamed, not like an animal might scream, but as a human might, in pain and agony. The monster's screams knifed into Draco's ears, sending him stumbling back, and he felt Harry catch him hard around the arm, steadying him. The 2 boys stood and stared as the manticore gave another final howl and crashed to the ground like a tree falling, its tail still jetting blood, head lolling, limbs rigid as broomsticks. Is it dead? Harry hissed, his voice hard. Not yet, said Draco, and almost as if it had heard him, the manticore's huge dinner-plate eyes snapped wide open. Its gaze was fixed on Draco, who involuntarily took a step forward. It spoke. I know you, it snarled, and its voice was like gravel running over sandpaper. The beast's eyes rolled, the whites showing briefly. It seemed to be struggling to move. Master, it growled, why do you slay me? It was you who made me what I am. Draco stared, feeling his heart beating in slow, uneven thumps as the adrenaline slowly drained out of his veins.
leaving him dizzy and sick. "No," he said, his voice harsh. "Not me." "I know you," said the manticore again. And then a great spasm racked its body. Its eyes shut, and it died. After the howls and the screaming and the deafening sounds of the fight, the silence that descended on the room once the manticore was dead was profound. Draco turned slowly and looked at Harry and got something of a shock. Harry was drenched in blood, a little of his own, probably, but mostly the monster's. His shirt and hands were soaked scarlet, his hair plastered to his head, and rivulets of blood were running down his face and neck. "I guess we won," he said bemusedly. Draco glanced down at himself. He was splattered with blood as well, but not nearly as drenched as Harry. "It's dead, if that's what you mean," he said, and looked up to find the other boys staring at him. "It said something to you," said Harry, gesturing at the manticore. "What did it say?" Draco blinked in surprise. "You mean you didn't understand it?" Harry shook his head. No, I didn't." Draco opened his mouth to reply, and was cut off as a loud grinding noise emanated from the corner of the room. Both the boys whirled around, holding their swords. From the distant wall, a dark space grew large enough for several persons to walk through. They stood frozen, looking at each other as a flicker of movement came out of the dark space, and suddenly a figure emerged into the room. Salazar Slytherin, flanked by 6 tall, gray-clad men who could only be guards, their faces half hidden by the hoods of their robes, and beside them stood another figure wearing long robes of indigo blue, over which was swathed a hooded black cloak. Suddenly, the dark space vanished, the wall reappearing, and Draco was unnerved to see that Slytherin was smiling. He froze, then went for his sword, but it was too late.
"Legatus,"
said Slytherin swiftly, raising his hand, and Draco suddenly found his arms snapped behind his back, his wrists bound tightly together with what felt like the adamantine cuffs once more. He turned his head and saw the same had happened to Harry. Having bound them, Slytherin appeared to briefly lose interest in the boys. He walked over to the dead body of the manticore and knelt down, his eyes dark and unreadable. Finally, he raised his head and looked at Harry and Draco.
"You killed it, did you not?"
he said. Neither of them replied.
"Have you no answer for me?"
the Snake Lord demanded. "Oh, I've got an answer for you, all right," said Draco. "Only you can't see it, because my hands are tied." Then Harry spoke, his voice flat with hatred. "Yes, I killed your monster," he said, "and it died horribly, and we are not sorry."
"I am very pleased to hear you say that,"
said Slytherin, standing up, the smile he had entered the room with never leaving his face.
"I brought you here to kill it. Thank you both very much."
Ginny looked up as Ron came into the kitchen, carrying a blue-bound book in his hands. "How's Hermione?" she asked. "Sleeping, finally," he said as he flopped down into a chair. "That's good," Charlie said, and proffered a plate of biscuits. Ron reached out to take one and suddenly turned as a flicker of movement caught his eye. "Mum?" Mrs. Weasley was standing in the doorway, wearing one of her more patched old robes and looking tired. She smiled when Ron glanced up at her. "No, Mum," said Charlie. "Tea?" "No, there was just something I wanted to show you. I was cleaning up Percy's room, you know, to take my mind off things, and I found this in the pocket of his pajamas." She held out a folded piece of parchment. "It's addressed to Draco Malfoy." Eyes widening, Charlie took the parchment, Thanks, Mum. Mrs. Weasley smiled and left. Charlie began unfolding the missive. Ron craned his neck over to get a better view. What's it say? Nose out, Ron, said Charlie, not unkindly, and started scanning the letter. As he read it, his face set into a strange expression. Come on, wheedled Ron. What's it say? Charlie ignored him and got to his feet, then went over to the fireplace and knelt down by the flames. Auditory Malfoy Manor, he said, and after a few moments, Narcissa's head and shoulders appeared among the low flames. She looked exhausted, her eyes ringed by black shadows, but when she saw Charlie, her dark eyes widened. Yes, she said. Is there any news? No, said Charlie, gently but firmly. I'm sorry. Is everything all right, then? As well as can be expected. I've got something here I thought might be of interest to you and Sirius. Is he around? He came home, but he went straight to the dungeons. I think he's checking on, well, the situation. Ah, said Charlie diplomatically, and held out the folded square of parchment. Narcissa reached a pale, slender hand out of the fire and took it from him. It's addressed to Draco, said Charlie, from Snape. Ron and Ginny, who were listening intently, both bolted upright at the sound of Snape's name. Narcissa's eyes flicked up to Charlie's, then back down to the letter. Apparently he brewed up some kind of willpower potion for Draco, said Charlie, to help him resist the pull of Slytherin. I thought Sirius might be interested. But Narcissa had already vanished, the parchment clutched tightly in her hands. She stood in a clearing at the heart of a forest, in the center of which stood a tree. It was the greatest tree she could ever have imagined, and more than that. The giant roots rose above her head like the rafters of a monstrous hall. Beyond that, she could see the huge, twisted trunk going up and up and up, so high that she could just make out the great dark shadowy spread of leaves and branches. A tiny black speck floated among them. As it drew closer, she saw that it was a glittering thing, not a bird, but a small winged serpent with jeweled scales. It landed on the earth a few feet from her, where it twisted, rippled, and became a man. She felt no surprise, as she had already known it would be him. He was very pale, wearing dark green robes and something bound around his waist, a sword. His expression was both contained and terribly tense. The skin of his face was tight against the bones. His eyes, once silver, now black, fixed on her. You called me here, he said flatly. What do you want? I wanted to give you this, she said, and held out something that glittered like a sparkling stone. He made no move to take it. So, it is final, then? She nodded. It's final. I will be your source no longer. This is because of Godric, he said furiously. Godric has nothing to do with it. I could force you, he said ruminatively. There are ways. An unwilling source is useless, she said. You know that. Doesn't it matter that I love you? She raised her chin, glaring at him. You don't love me. He crossed the clearing and seized her by the wrists. How can you say that to me? He hissed. Because it's true. You don't love me. You only want more power, more knowledge, more monstrous creatures to do your bidding. My affections have changed, and that only makes you want me more. That's not love, only avarice. He caught her by the hair and pulled her sharply against him. She tried to pull away, pushing at his hands as he grinned at her. Fight me, why don't you? He hissed down at her. Bite me, claw at me. You can't bring yourself to hurt me, not even in this. I can hurt you, she hissed back, and I will. His eyes narrowed. Yes, you are planning something, aren't you? You and the others. I know it. I hear things. We're just protecting ourselves. Then why are you making keys for a weapon? Her heart seemed to freeze inside her chest. She stared at him. How does he know? His smile widened. I have informants, he said, grinning like a cat. Don't think you can do anything without my knowing about it. And don't think that just because I've lost you as my source, I am weak. I have another source of power now. Salazar, what? Her words were cut short as his mouth came down on hers. She grit her teeth to keep him out, but eventually her lips parted to gain air. He tasted like cold metal. Horror assailed her, but even as it did, her blood pounded hard in her ears, and she wondered despairingly how the one person you loved best in the world could somehow become the person you most hated. She tried to turn her face away, but he had already pulled back, releasing her, laughing as she turned to run, and his laughter was the last thing she heard. The scene shifted, melting away like ice. She was sitting in the great hall at Hogwarts. Facing her across the table was a man with dark hair, an honest, worried face, and dark green eyes. A number of items lay scattered across the table. Books, parchment, quills, a mortar and pedestal, a scabbard of a sword, the lycanthie, and an object that looked like an hourglass or an infinity sign. We're going to have to kill him, he said. She shook her head vehemently. No, I don't want to do that. There is no other way, Rowena. There is another way. Helga and I have been working on additions to the curse. Even if he is able to wake from it, to shake off the spell, he will not be able to leave the place we have bound him. We will turn his own monsters against him and make them his guardians. All this just to keep him alive, said Godric. I can't kill him, Godric. I can't. There's still some good in him, something that can be redeemed. And while he is held, I will discover how that can be accomplished. So much effort expended to preserve a life that is worth so little, said Godric in a bitter tone. The Dormian's curse will not hold him. It binds the soul of a man, and I am not sure that he has much soul left for us to bind. There is one more thing, she heard her own voice say haltingly. Godric looked up. What? She met his gaze squarely. Have you ever heard of an epicilical charm? Hermione felt her own sleeping body jerk in shock, and Godric's face wavered and vanished. She tried to clutch at the shreds of the dream, but heard only voices echoing in her head, clear, if muffled, like voices heard in another room. We will have to prepare faster, that's all. Helga was saying. The lycanthie is ready, the turner. Now we just need Godric's key. The voices rose to a jumbled scream. What source is he using, if not me? Where would he find another Majid willing to be his source? Maybe it's not a Majid at all. He could have called up something. We need to hide the keys. Helga can hide them. She knows how to put up walls. There's so little time. Hermione. Someone had her by the wrist and was saying a name, but it wasn't her name. Or was it? She blinked her eyes open and saw a formless dark mass of shadows, which resolved itself slowly into a black and white Ron, sitting on the edge of her bed and peering at her anxiously. Dizzily, she reached out and caught at him with her free hand, pulling him forward with such force that he nearly overbalanced. She caught herself on a ragged gasp and closed her eyes, her heart pounding. I was dreaming, she said, half to him, half to herself. Ron pulled back slightly, sitting up, but not taking his hand off her wrist. I figured. You were shouting. You were yelling for Godric. Would that be Godric Gryffindor? Or is there something I should be telling Harry? Because I really don't think... Hermione hit her head gently against his shoulder. Shut up.
Ron sighed, but didn't move. She could hear the gentle thump-thump sound of his heart, steady as a metronome, reliable as Ron himself. "I heard all these voices," she whispered, looking up at him. "Rowena and Godric. They were talking about the keys and where they were hidden. I think Ginny's right. There's something on the grounds here. Maybe in the cellar." "Hermione," cut in Ron, "they're just dreams. Maybe just a residual from that sleeping draught or something." "No," Hermione spoke firmly. "They're not just dreams." She reached out, took hold of the lycanthy, and held it out to Ron. "This connects me to them, to Harry, and especially to Draco. If I can dream of what he's been dreaming, maybe I can see what he's seen. Anyway, I'm learning from it. I'm beginning to understand how everything is linked together. How what happened in the past is affecting what's happening now." Ron was looking at her steadily, and she thought she saw concern in his clear blue eyes. "Hermione," he said slowly, "don't take this the wrong way, but you seem a little too intense about this. I don't know what that thing is." He jerked his chin towards the lycanthy. "But you're looking at it the way Draco looked at that sword of his. I don't like it." "Not all power is bad, Ron." "Maybe not," he said, detaching himself from her and standing up. "But how can you tell the difference?" She shivered a little, although it wasn't cold in the room, and tugged at her sleeve. "I'm not sure I can." She raised her head and looked at Ron, who was standing by the window now, looking out at the garden. She decided not to tell him how afraid she was, afraid of what was inside her, inside Draco, inside Harry and Ginny. What engraved pattern of history, genetics, and destiny they might now be carrying inside them, inescapable, endless, repeating. Suddenly she found that she was clutching the lycanthy in her right hand so tightly she could feel the points digging into her palm. "Ron, the quarry." Ron looked over at her. "What about it?" he asked, sounding vaguely exasperated. "What if what Ginny was looking for wasn't in the cellar, but in the quarry instead?" Ron stared at her for a moment, and then a grin flashed across his face, lighting his eyes. "In all this time I thought you were just faking being clever." Hermione grinned back. "Have you got a shovel?" Sirius looked through the bars of the dungeon cell that held Lupin. He had ceased flinging himself against the walls some time ago, and was now crouched, narrow-eyed and whimpering at intervals at the far side of the cell. Sirius stood, an object in each of his hands, and looked at the wolf. He heard Mad Eye's voice in his head. "It's not a pleasant process, being cold. It's agonizing, and it goes on until the one being cold either answers the summons or dies." Slowly he raised his left hand, in which something glittered through the murky underwater light of the dungeon. "I found this in my vault at Gringotts," he said softly, not looking at the wolf, but at what he held in his hand. "James gave it to me to give to Harry. The problem is, Harry isn't around for me to give it to him, and James isn't around to tell me what it's supposed to be for, and I don't know what to do with the blasted thing myself. It's obviously magical, but even a magical key isn't much bloody good without a lock, is it? Now I know what you'd say, Moony. Sirius, you're being obvious. Sometimes a key isn't just a key." Sirius paused, aware that he was rambling, and leaned his head against the cold bars of the cell. What's the point? You don't understand a word I'm saying." As he leaned forward, the wolf whimpered and skittered back.
"He fears you,"
said the demon at Sirius's back. "And how do you know?" snarled Sirius, not turning around.
"Is that blade you hold in your right hand silver?"
Sirius turned around slowly and looked at the demon with bleak black eyes. Then he looked down at the knife, which he had taken from Lucius's armory, because it was the finest weapon he could find, and because the opals in the hilt reminded him of moons, and it seemed fitting.
The killing curse is cleaner,
observed the demon, as if reading his mind. He deserves better than that, said Sirius. He was still looking down at the knife, but knew it wouldn't matter what kind of weapon he killed his friend with. He would still be dead. He'd do it for me, Sirius thought, but the thought lacked the resonance it had before. The demon chuckled.
You cannot do it.
Sirius ignored it.
Perhaps,
said the demon.
There might be another way.
Sirius continued to ignore it. The demon shrugged.
Very well. I did not come here to bargain.
What did you come here for? Snarled Sirius. You say that you didn't come to kill Harry, but you tried to—
I was not trying to kill him. I was trying to warn him.
You attacked him.
I tried to make him listen. I tried to tell him that his life was in danger from the Snake Lord. But he and the seventh son, they did not want to hear me.
Sirius looked at the creature now with something akin to curiosity. The seventh son? Who are you talking about? The demon waved an impatient hand in his direction.
The red-haired boy. He is the seventh son, Diviner.
Sirius glared at the demon. A what?
A diviner!
The demon repeated impatiently.
What, have you never seen one before?
But he hates divination, Sirius replied without thinking. Harry told me so. The demon rolled its eyes. Clearly this line of questioning was boring it.
Then he must not have had the proper teaching. Being a seventh son and a diviner is a gift, and like all gifts, it is a double-edged blade. With some training, he could be powerful.
Sirius stood motionless, his heart beating hard. Surely the creature was lying, and yet— What do you care what happens to Ron? He demanded. For that matter, what do you care what happens to Harry? The demon shrugged.
We do not care. You are asking the wrong questions.
Sirius took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the demon's red ones. What's your name, anyway? The demon looked shifty.
Very well. As a sign of goodwill, I will tell you my name. It is Strygaldria. Conjure with it, and I will eat your heart and liver.
Sirius doubted he'd be doing much conjuring with a name he couldn't even pronounce. So, what does Slytherin want with Harry? He demanded. And by reflex glanced at the red jewel in his bracelet, which pulsed with a steady light.
We are owed life,
said the demon.
The bargain made with the Snake Lord was the most binding of bargains. The gift of demonic power in exchange for—
His life, said Sirius. After a certain term of years. I get it. The demon giggled.
Not his life, it sneered. Who would make a bargain like that?
Then
the life of his heir, specifically a matric descendant of his own blood. That was the bargain. That was why Slytherin was desperate to produce an heir when he was alive. Once he gives his own descendant's life freely to us, we have no choice but to consider the debt cancelled.
Harry, whispered Sirius, raising his head to stare at the demon. Strygaldr grinned, showing more than one set of teeth. It was not a pleasant grin.
Why not? Both boys are midgets, descendants of Slytherin's blood, cousins of a sort. The Snake Lord needs to keep one boy alive and by his side, but the other will be a sacrifice. Slytherin's hatred of his cousin knows no bounds. He would consider it a nice irony to use Godric's heir for such a purpose. It will be as if Godric himself has set him free.
Why do you care if he uses Harry to fill his bargain? Sirius snarled. What difference does it make to you?
Because,
said the demon, red eyes whirring.
This bargain was made 1,000 years ago, when we were rich in items of true magic and poor in magids. The art of making living blades is long lost. That sword is one of 2 remaining in the world and is far more valuable to us than the life of a Majid child. There are plenty of Majids around these days, but we cannot take the sword back until Slytherin forfeits his bargain. And that will not happen until...
In other words, you'd simply rather have the sword than Harry. Very nice, Sirius interrupted, shaking his head.
I'm a demon. We're not interested in nice. Anyway, it is too late for Godric's heir. The Snake Lord has him now.
Sirius's head was swimming. Why does Slytherin need one boy alive and by his side? He thought, and then remembered Remus's voice, saying the words of the prophecy. When the sword is once again wielded in battle by a descendant of Slytherin, Slytherin himself will return, and he and his descendants will join together to wreak havoc and terror on the Wizarding World. Remus. He turned back to the other cell, where the werewolf lay. It bared its teeth at him as he approached, its dark eyes wide with ferocity or pain, or some combination of the two.
Are you going to kill him finally?
Drawled the demon at Sirius's back. No, replied Sirius, shoving the knife he had been holding through the loop in his belt. I'm going to let him out.
He'll tear you apart,
said the demon, sounding impressed, either by Sirius's bravery or his stupidity. Sirius wasn't sure. Maybe, said Sirius, maybe not. He reached for the cell door. Sirius! It was Narcissa. She stood at the entrance to the dungeon, very pale in her white robes. Sirius, she said again, catching her breath, I think you should read this. And she held out the folded piece of parchment in her hand. Ron, be quiet. You'll wake everyone up. Stop clomping your feet. I'm not clomping. I'm just walking. Well, walk more quietly. Ron rolled his eyes. Come on, Hermione. Everyone's asleep. Everyone except us, of course, said a voice out of the darkness. Ron and Hermione both jumped and stared. The kitchen was suddenly bright with light, revealing Charlie and Ginny sitting together at the kitchen table, looking at them very much askance. Charlie was holding his wand, from which bright light emanated. What are you doing sitting here with the lights off? Ron demanded indignantly. I heard you two whispering while you were coming down the stairs, said Charlie. Thought we'd give you a bit of a scare. What are you two doing? And what's with the shovel? Ginny asked. Well, usually you use a shovel to dig, Ginny, replied Ron sarcastically. Ginny opened her mouth to make a sharp comeback, but Charlie cut across her. All right, he said, standing up. You have 5 minutes to explain to me what you're doing sneaking outside in the wee hours of the night with a shovel. Starting now. Ron and Hermione looked at each other. He shrugged, and Hermione sighed, then turned back to Charlie and Ginny to begin explaining. When she was done, Charlie scratched his head, looking somewhat woeful. You realize you can't get into the quarry. The auras are under strict instructions to keep us all inside. There was a doleful silence, which was broken by Ginny. There might be another way, she said slowly. Ron perked up his ears. What do you mean? When I was down in the cellar today, I noticed when I went down one corridor that the ceiling got damper and damper,
and after a while it started to drip water on me. I think it was going under the quarry." Hermione clapped her hands. "Jane, you're brilliant. Let's go." Ron looked green. "Down into the cellar?" he echoed faintly. "What's wrong with the cellar?" Hermione demanded. Ron gestured faintly. "Spiders?" "I'll protect you, Ron," said Charlie heroically. "Besides," he added, dropping his voice, "I'm dying to see if Fred and George still keep their magazine collection down there." Harry stared, flabbergasted. Even Draco seemed to be having a slight difficulty controlling his expression. He actually looked surprised for a millisecond, before his usual look of smug amusement returned. "Well, well," he said, looking at Slytherin. "So you planned all this, did you? Couldn't be bothered to go kill your little beastie all on your own, so you got a couple of teenagers to do it for you. And here I thought you were the big bad Snake Lord." Harry glared over at him, warning him to shut up. "Draco, be quiet," said a voice from under the cloak. A girl's voice, one Harry recognized. Slowly, 2 pale hands slid out from under the cloak and drew the hood back. Hair, like a cloud of silver thread, spilled out, framing a familiar porcelain face. Dark blue eyes raised themselves haughtily, black eyelashes sweeping low. There was a clang. Draco had dropped his sword in amazement. "Fleur?" he demanded, shock having stripped the drawl from his voice. "What are you doing here?" Fleur raised her chin, her dark blue eyes wide. "Isn't it obvious?" she said. "I am here on orders from my master." Harry felt as if his jaw were hanging off its hinges. "Your master?" Fleur looked delicately remorseful. "Surely you are not really surprised," she said, then turned to Draco. "Remember when I asked you to marry me and you refused? Well, I had to find another source of power when you refused me. I have no choice. Do you understand?" Draco turned cold grey eyes on her. "I understand that you're a traitorous bitch," he said flatly. Fleur looked shocked.
Now,
said Slytherin, still smiling his off-kilter smile.
that is no way to talk to my source.
Now even Harry looked shocked and somewhat thrown. "Your source? Her?" Slytherin took a step towards him, and Harry flinched back almost imperceptibly.
Of course, her. Why not?
Harry said nothing, but standing behind him, Draco could see his hands knotted together.
That does not mean that I have no further use for you, Draco,
said Slytherin, and looked at the other boy.
You have exceeded my expectations. Many have faced the Manticore, and many have died. You are to be congratulated.
Like Harry, Draco said nothing. Neither did he look towards Harry, or move. Harry would have liked to take the opportunity of being ignored to do something brave and heroic, but couldn't think of a thing, other than running up and kicking Slytherin in the ankles, which seemed ineffectual. It's not much bloody good being a magician, he thought bitterly, if you still need your hands to do magic.
Nobody else could have done it,
Slytherin continued.
My enemies somehow managed to coerce that monster to guard the one object that can return my powers to me. Only an heir of the Founders could have defeated it, especially Gryffindor's heir, since he fancies himself a monster killer.
And his icy gaze darted back over to Harry. There was a short silence, then Slytherin turned his focus back to Draco, the look of hatred fading from his gaze.
Truly, boy, you did an excellent job. As your ancestor, I am proud of you,
he said.
I wonder what the rest of them would say if they were alive at this moment.
Probably let me out of this crypt. It's dark in here, Draco suggested. Slytherin laughed, something Harry would not have imagined he could do.
Clever as always,
the Snake Lord observed, and moved away from Draco.
And now that you have completed this messy business, you have earned yourself a reward. Come with me now, and we will discuss it. That is,
he added,
if you are willing.
Draco raised his head. His eyes looked dark, nearly black, but perhaps that was only a trick of the light. I am tired of fighting you, he said. No matter how far I ran, you still won't leave me alone.
No,
said the Snake Lord.
And I never will.
Draco closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he looked determined. Unbind me, he said, and Harry went cold all over. Slytherin glanced at Fleur, who appeared to be studying the ground. Then he lifted his hand and extended it towards Draco.
Liberus,
he said. The cuffs fell from Draco's wrists to the marble floor with a clatter, and vanished. Slowly, he brought his arms forward and began rubbing the feeling back into his hands. Thank you, he said.
You are my descendant,
said the Snake Lord.
You should not be bound.
Oh, I very much agree with that, said Draco, and he grinned, not at anyone in particular. He seemed different than he had a short while ago, like an animal you wouldn't want to approach, for fear of being bitten. So, I have a question, he added, rocking back on his heels. What do you plan to do with Potter? Once again, Slytherin looked over at Harry, his eyes full of cold fire and hatred.
The Gryffindor heir has served his purpose,
said the Snake Lord.
You could not have defeated the Magical without him, but now that is done, he will serve me better dead than alive. Guards, bring the boy here.
2 guards detached themselves from the group, strode over to Harry, and seized him. He struggled, but it was no use. They were stronger than he was, and without his hands, he was helpless. They dragged him forward until he stood less than a foot from Slytherin, almost face to face with Draco. Draco's gaze was ice as their eyes met, but there was nothing in them. No expression, no fear or fury. Nothing.
Take the Gryffindor boy to my adamantine cell and chain him up,
Slytherin said to his guards. The guards moved to do their master's bidding, and as they began to drag him away, Harry struggled to look back, not knowing why he wanted to, only that he did, and saw Draco and Slytherin standing together by the body of the dead Manticore. From a distance, it was hard to tell which was which, and before Harry could discern the difference, the guards had dragged him through the door and shut it firmly behind him. They had been down in the cellar for about 30 minutes before they reached the door. Ginny was leading the way, her wand out and glowing, Charlie behind her. Then came Hermione, who had discovered that she could use the lycanthropy a bit like a torch. It glowed when she lifted it in her hand. Then came Ron, muttering slightly, but looking around with great interest. It was a good thing, thought Hermione, that Ginny seemed to know where she was going, or they'd all be lost. It really wasn't so much a cellar as a warren of tunnels and passages. She noticed that the ground seemed to be increasingly sloping downward as they went, and, as Ginny had said, the walls were getting wetter and more covered in moss. The air was also getting colder and filling the space around them with a dampish white mist. Ron suddenly gave a startled yell, and Hermione whirled around. "Ron, are you all right?" Looking greenish in the light of the lycanthropy, he stared down at his foot with a look of horror. "Spider," he said in a choked sort of voice, "crawled up my trouser leg." Hermione rolled her eyes. "Honestly, Ron," she snapped, and dropped down to her knees at his feet. She yanked his trouser leg up and removed the offending arachnid from his ankle. It was a very small spider, pale gray and rather cute. "Look," she said, waving it at Ron, who hopped backward.
It's just a teeny little spider. It was probably just looking for somewhere warm. Ron glared back at her. You don't understand. You never had to go into the Forbidden Forest and nearly get eaten by a spider the size of a mini just because Harry's an idiot. Hermione stood up and made a face at him. Harry's not an idiot. Ron just looked at her. She sighed. Oh, all right, he is, but not all the time. Hey, came Charlie's voice from further down the corridor. Come here and look at this. What is it? Asked Hermione, coming up to Ginny, and immediately saw what the problem was. The passageway ended in a huge stone door. Well, not a very useful door, as it had no knob or other way of opening it, but it was still a door. All along the front of it were deep grooves and scratches, weaving themselves into the stone in mesmerizing designs. Dead end, said Ron behind her, sounding gloomy. Not necessarily, said Hermione. I don't think it's a dead end. I think it's an obstacle. And the difference would be that there's a way to get past it. This looks like writing, interrupted Ginny, leaning closer with her wand. Hermione bent down, tracing the grooves in the stone with her finger, and brought the light close to the foot of the wall. There was a design there, etched into the corner of the stone. It looked like a tiny weasel, or a badger, wearing a crown on its little head. Hufflepuff, she thought, stepping back and raised the lycanthie in her hand, then lowered it, biting her lip. Why'd you do that? Asked Ginny irritably. I was reading it. Hermione stared at her, nonplussed. But Ginny, it's just lines and squiggles. Ginny looked up at her, shocked. It makes perfect sense. It's some kind of poem. Bring the light back down here. Startled, Hermione knelt down next to Ginny, and Charlie followed. It looks like gibberish to me, said Ron, looking doubtful, and Charlie agreed. Ginny shook her head, her red hair catching the waving wand light. No, it's a poem. When there is fire in me, then I am still cold. When I own your true love's face, then you will not see me. To all things I give no more than I am given. In time I may have all things, and yet I can keep nothing. There was a long silence. Hermione expelled her breath in amazement. It's a riddle, she said. What kind of riddle is that? Ginny demanded, sitting back on her heels. It's not even a question. The question is implied, put in Charlie. It's describing a thing, or a person, we have to identify. Ron grinned. And it couldn't have just asked, what's red and green and goes round and round? Hermione squeezed his arm impatiently. Shh! Everybody think. To all things I give no more than I am given. In time I may have all things, and yet I can keep nothing. So it's not a person. Ron looked at her with concern. Hermione, if you answer wrong, you don't know what will happen. It could be dangerous. Ron's right, agreed Charlie, looking nervously at the wet, cold walls and heavy, hanging shadows. Hermione ignored them both. When there is fire in me, then I am still cold. When I own your true love's face, then you will not see me. Hermione, said Ron, are you listening? Hermione raised her head. A mirror, she said. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a creaking noise, the door swung wide, revealing a long, narrow, deeply slanted passageway twisting down into the darkness. Reparo. Snape watched as the shattered bits of his record fitted themselves back together. Within a moment, it looked as it had before Draco Malfoy had broken it. Sitting in the dark in his dusty living room, and with the windows closed firmly against the dark night air outside, the room was full of dull light. He had not been in here since he had found his favorite student sitting on the floor, eyes like blank mirrors, playing a spinning record above his hand. He wondered if he should regret telling the boy so harshly that his father was dead. But no, he had had to do something to snap
Draco back to reality. He had looked as if he were drifting off, unmoored. Snape had seen that look before in the eyes of Voldemort's servants. Sometimes one could come back from that, sometimes not. Draco had come back, but for how long? He knew the boy had gotten the package he had sent containing the flask of the new willpower potion he had developed, and the note explaining what it did because his owl had returned. But it had brought no reply with it. He realized, with an odd sort of pang at the heart, that he was worried. It had been a long time since he had been worried about anyone. Bang! Bang! There was an insistent pounding noise coming from the front door. Slowly, he got to his feet, drawing his robes tighter around him, and went quickly down the hallway towards the front door, where the pounding was growing louder and more persistent by the moment. He reached out his hand for the knob, and paused, hatred making him keenly aware of who was standing on his porch, even as he reached out and drew the door open. The man standing on the porch looked exhausted. His dark eyes were ringed by blacker shadows, his hair disheveled and awry, his mouth set in a tense, hard line. Sirius Black raised his head, and for the first time in 20 years, looked Snape straight in the eyes. And Snape saw that in his hand, Sirius had a folded piece of parchment with Snape's own handwriting on it. "I need your help," he said. And that is all for this chapter, guys. Quotes. Bindings and Summonings is from Books of Magic by Neil Gaiman. Scrumdiddlyumptious Chocolate Bar is from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. It is Strygaldundir, Conjure with It and I Will Eat Your Heart and Liver, is from The Guns of Avalon by Roger Zelazny. I hope I said that right. Thank you so much for joining me. And again, if you are enjoying this content, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel. And if you are interested in supporting me monetarily, I have a Patreon and a Ko-fi linked in the About section of this channel. For those of you who may not already be aware, I am doing something special for the 25 Days of Christmas, which starts on December 25th and goes to January 5th, where I am reading my own Harry Potter fan fictions that my best friend and I wrote way back in the early aughts, and I am releasing that exclusively on my Patreon at the $2 tier. And this is only for the 12 days of Christmas. So if you guys are interested in all, at all, in hearing those recitations, then pop over to my Patreon. Those will be active for the dates I just listed above before they go under higher tiers. But if you happen to stick around on my Patreon, because at the $2 tier you will see other things that I do as well. Anyway, guys, that is all that I have for this evening. I will see you all in the next one. Good night.